Committee on Monday the 3rd of December 2018. Today we're looking at the National Audit Office's report on the Ministry of Defence's equipment plan from 2018 to 2028, which sets out the department's spend on defence equipment in the years to come. We're pleased, I have to say, one little positive, Mr Lovegrove, at the beginning, is that the plan's available earlier than before, but it's still unaffordable. So we'll be probing you a lot on the numbers. In fact, the forecast costs exceed budget by $7 billion over the next 10 years. And you've got this immediate challenge, Ms Little, which we'll get into, of the fact that 84% of that difference falls in the first 4 years. So we know you've got a big challenge, and we want to probe how that's going to come about, and also point out that the National Audit Office thinks that the affordability gap could be considerably higher at $14.8 billion at its outside estimate. So it's a big challenge. I'll introduce our witnesses. We have, from my left to right, Cat Little, who is the Director General Finance at the Ministry of Defence. So Stephen Lovegrove, who is the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence. Sir Simon Bolam, the Chief Executive Officer for Defence Equipment and Support, DES. And Lieutenant General Sir Mark Poffley, the Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff at the Ministry of Defence. So a full suite of people. And I just wanted to kick off with the big challenge about why it's still unaffordable, Ms Little. I think it's a hard job to have turned it around in a year, but we're still much the same place as we were last year.
It is, yes. So just to be really clear about the range of affordability, and I hope the way in which we've set out what's driving the financial risks and the affordability position in the report was helpful. As he rightly said, so our central estimate of the affordability gap is likely to be around $7 billion. But, of course, it would be remiss of us not to point out some of the other financial risks that sit alongside the plan. So the fact that we know that, of course, forecasting over a longer period of time means that there's likely to be further hidden costs further down the road. Of course, we've got a £3 billion gap between our independent costing estimates and those which we've included in the plan. So we are absolutely under no illusion about the size and the scale of the challenge that we've got. I think the first thing I'd say is that the autumn budget settlement that we reached with the Treasury was an initial acceptance that there are some very difficult choices you've got to make in order to tackle the funding position of the department. And I think the Chancellor himself said to...
I'm going to come on to that. So how come we're in the same position as we were last year? What have you been doing over the last year to try and resolve this?
So, of course, the affordability position has improved. Last year we were looking at a much more extreme range of risk and much more risk sitting beneath our costing estimates. And I think the NAO has paid due credit to where we've included much more robust costing and assumptions in our plan. So part of the approach to the autumn budget was us being very, very transparent and clear about the fact that we are facing some very severe financial challenges, and also agreeing with Treasury that we need to look at this in the longer term as part of the spending review next year.
Right, well, I'm going to come on to actually the issues around the spending review in a moment. So, Mr Lovegrove, lots of people got their fingers in this pie. Who's ultimately responsible for plugging the multi-million-pound black hole?
Well, ultimately, when you have an affordability issue such as this, there are only two things that you can do. You can either apply more money to it, or you can run yourself either more efficiently or do less with the money that you do have. Once we have a settled financial position for the longer term, which is for the spending review, then clearly the responsibility lies with the accounting officer to make sure that the decisions are taken such that we stay within our funding envelope. At the moment, we are still in a position where we are doing both things. We are running...
You're doing both things. So is that a tacit admission that you can't do it all by efficiencies, that you're going to have to change tack and not do certain things, or de-scope defence projects?
I think unless there is a fundamentally different financial settlement on the department, then in due course we will have to de-scope or delay or defer or delete, actually, which is in some senses what I would prefer to do in a lot of cases, because merely delaying often drives cost in and complexity, as you know.
We've seen that. When I remember first coming on this committee, lots of things were done to sort out the budget. In fact, it just delayed them, and you're still picking up those problems now. So you're saying very clearly to us today that without more money, the department and the forces will have to actually stop doing certain projects.
I am certainly saying that. I think even if we do get more money, there are all the time lots of
projects that are in being looked at. That might
well, I think that would be preempting decisions which are properly for ministers to make. But almost every single programme that we have, and indeed activity, which costs a lot, indeed staffing levels, which also cost a lot, everything is in the hopper when we are deciding how we are going to make sure that we stay within our financial controls. And I am very clear as a
carriers. Probably you're not going to cancel them now, given that one's out in sea trials and one's going to be leaving Rosyth in the next year.
No, you're not.
No?
Though
Right,
I am not an expert on this. General Poffley would be better positioned to answer it. But you can certainly make decisions about the deployment schedules of the carriers, which have very, very significant financial consequences, because clearly not only are they very large ships with lots of equipment on them, but there's an awful lot of equipment that has to go around them as well. So there are many, many thousands of levers in the department that one can pull to make sure that we stay within our control totals. I'm very clear, though, Chair, that every year the accounting officer is responsible for coming in on budget, and that I am absolutely clear about. So I hope there's no...
Well, we're going to come on some of the specifics in a moment, particularly, there are some of the specific programmes. Lieutenant General Poffley, what have you been doing for the last year to try and resolve this gap?
Well, as you'll be aware, the Modernising Defence Programme has spent a lot of time analysing precisely how we would match the capability portfolio against the threat profile that we're seeing. And as many of you will know, that threat profile is dynamic and shifting. What the work that has gone on this year has done is make a very clear prioritisation of those things that we need to do in the short term and those where we need to preserve some choice well into the future. Because, well, again, I think without drifting too far into the Modernising Defence Programme, because as the Permanent Secretary says, these are pre-ministerial decisions. We have taken a very clear stance to make sure that we're able to build some resilience into our structures to counter threats such as that we're seeing from Russia at the moment, particularly in things like anti-submarine warfare and cyber. And I think, as you will have noted in the budget settlement recently, that was therefore the target for some of our investment. So we're very clear about where our top priorities are, and inevitably there's a debate, depending on where the financial cursor sits, as to the scope and appetite for taking the lower priority areas.
Okay, well, can I just go, probably between you and Mr Lovegrove, about the timetabling. You've talked about ministerial advice. We've got the Modernising Defence Programme. We were expecting to hear about that in July, and we're in December, and it's still not complete. We've got the spending review next spring, or whenever. Mr Lovegrove has the same approach to us as spring in the civil service, whichever point in 2019 that arrives. And then, presumably, the SDSR will be on track for... You're expecting an SDSR in strategic defence spending review in 2020 on top of that?
We haven't heard from colleagues in the Cabinet Office that is the case or is not the case. And certainly if you were to work on a normal quinquennial timetable, it'd be 2020.
18, and you as Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence don't know yet if there's going to be an SDSR?
I don't know at this point, no.
Political shaking your head as well.
There's plenty of other politics, I think, which is getting in the way of some of those longer range decisions. I would expect there to be an SDSR in 2020. Okay. We have run them on
so if there is,
okay,
let's work on the presumption that there is, and
yes.
I'm going to come to Mr Snell in a moment, but you've got, therefore, 3 different ministerial advice programmes, if you like, and one around the capability, one around spending, and the third around spending and capability, that are not aligned. So doesn't that not worry you, that you've got to shoehorn your decisions into these 3 different strands of thinking and come up with some coherent whole that also means that we actually balance, or you'll move towards balance in the budget.
If they were not aligned, it would worry me.
You think they are aligned?
They will become aligned. I mean,
your knighthood is following.
We are hopefully coming to the end of MDP at the moment, modernising defence programme at the moment, and I think the Secretary of State has said that he'd hope to say something about that before Christmas. And he did report to Parliament in July with a statement outlining some of the progress that we had made. And we have made...
Very generous of you to call it a statement. It didn't say a great deal. But anyway, you can't say that about a ministerial statement.
I'm very happy to...
He reported to Parliament on time, even if he didn't say anything.
But a lot of what has been going on in the MDP has been completely visible all the way through. So the way in which we are thinking about the operating model, the way in which we have been thinking about our strategic supplier framework, the way in which we have sought to clean up, clarify and codify for the future our efficiency programme. We've been pretty open about all of that stuff. So actually I suspect when the MDP does conclude, there is, for instance, in those areas, not going to be a whole lot of new material there anyway, because we have been relatively pretty open book about it, and I'm very happy to talk about it a bit more today. We would expect the spending review and are planning already for the spending review to be a continuation of some of the work streams that we have been working on the MDP with, and we've already I've already been in contact with both colleagues in the Cabinet Office and in Treasury to say this is where we are with the MDP. These are, we think, are the questions that remain for us for the SR. Do you agree that that's a good work programme for us to be able to chunk through over the next few months?
So we know the process, then you go pitching in straight into the SDSR. So there could be a disconnect there.
There could be. I have not heard definitively that there will be an SDSR in 2015. As I say, a 5-yearly interval is common, but it's not. It hasn't always been like that. It may be that the government of the day may feel that actually there has been enough in the SR to push it out a year. I'm afraid, cannot help you on that. Chair.
Mr. Snell.
Mr. Musgrove, if you said the MDP will align with the CSR and then the likely SDSR, if we don't end up with an SDSR in 2020, how dependent upon the MDP is getting this particular plan back into budgetary balance?
It's more reliant at this point on the SR next year. The Chancellor was very clear in the budget when he said that and I quote, comprehensive consideration of defence spending will occur next year in the spending review. We were very pleased to see the recognition that he made of the pressures on the department this year at the budget, but we would expect there to be the kind of discussion that you mentioned in the SR.
So what has been the cause of delay in the MDP? Because we are running to a point where the MDP could be almost immediately out of date by the time it's actually properly enacted after it's been announced to the House, once the CSR is announced.
I confess I feel a bit frustrated with the sense that there are these snapshot moments where you fix a vision for defence and a appreciation of the threat that defence is trying to deal with, and then you park it for a bit and then you come back to it. So I am much more attracted on a day-to-day basis running the department in a rather more iterative, sort of not circular, a spiral development of reviews. I actually don't mind that much that we have one review possibly running into another review with slightly different focuses, because that is really the way in which the world works.
Except you have a defence equipment plan for the next 10 years that has a £7 billion black hole in it, the majority of which is going to be accumulated over the next 4 years. And if you like the longer term plan, if the MDP and the CSR and the SGSR roll into one, where in that cycle of 3 potential spiralling reviews is the actual plan that means that you fill that black hole, either by doing the deferring and the deleting you mentioned, or by getting more money out of Treasury?
Well, the budget of a month ago has set us fair for 1920. Well, it has preserved choice in a way that we would not have been able to preserve.
One of the problems with your department, Mr. Lovegrove, is that it constantly kicks the can of choice down the road for as long as it can, and therefore defers making big decisions about closing down or deleting or deferring. So simply prolonging that agony of choice doesn't actually mean that the equipment plan comes into balance, does it?
It certainly doesn't come into balance as a result of the announcements at budget. I mean, the budget was avowedly for 1 year only. I must say that on a 1 year basis, I would much prefer to preserve choice for a different tone of spending discussion with the Treasury and number 10 in the SR. I am expecting in the SR that the position that you are highlighting, which is the 3 years, and the NAO is very clear about this, and they're absolutely right. We have the biggest funding crunch in the 3 years, sort of post next year. In that SR, we need to close with that. If we don't, then we will need to start taking some of the more difficult decisions which were delayed as a result of the budget announcement.
So my question is, and I think Mr. Chapman, my question is simple. When will the department make a decision that starts to address that funding crunch that we all agree exists? Because to date, there is no timescale for a decision to be made. There is no timescale for, as we know, the CSR to be actually delivered. So when will your department make a decision, or when do you expect ministers to make a decision on what will and won't happen?
I expect the SR to occur next year. We have been told pretty much the same as you have, which will happen in roughly the middle of next year. That is the moment at which we will be addressing the whatever it is, 3 year period to follow. So that is the moment I think you're looking at.
Any decisions until after the CSR? What is the point of the MDP?
The MDP has, as I say, there is a spiral and a continuum of analysis in this area, which has to go on all the time. All countries do this. In fact, actually, many countries have guiding documents which then get filled in 2 years later, and then there is an update a year after that.
But Lieutenant General Poffley, you spoke about already, thinking about change of capability and the modernising defence programme being very helpful in that process. So are you actually beginning to make decisions about stopping things, even if you're not willing or able to share it with us now, in line with what Mr Lovegrove has just outlined?
As you go through our programme, in tackling the short term, particularly those early years, we will be drawing off some of the analysis that we have undertaken over the course of this year.
In your mind now, are you actually talking to people, even if not to us or in public, to commands, to people running particular projects, that project will be wound down, reduced, that the capability issues will be addressed? Are you having those capability discussions with the budget holders? And the budget
we
managers?
have those conversations routinely all of the time, and inevitably quite a lot of that discussion has been informed by the analysis that we have done to determine whether we have realistic costings and get a proper sense as to whether we can hone down on that, where we think we can deliver more productivity, what's coming out of the efficiency work, and then that threat-based analysis which helps us in the prioritisation.
But so
of our
particularly, are you talking to anyone about stopping any particular programme?
We routinely talk with each of the frontline commands about the judgments of that type on an annual basis, and that's a conversation that rolls right the way through the year. So it is conditioned by what we've been doing on MDP.
Options are always being produced. There are lots and lots of options, but it's a question of when decisions get.
Yeah, but actually, sometimes wholesale stopping something is a very big decision, and the longer it goes on, as Mr. Snell has highlighted, we dribble into the we pinches the SDSR. These decisions and these costs still going on in something that might be being considered for stopping now. Is that?
Yeah, but Mr. Snell is absolutely right to say there is. You can't, as you say, keep pushing the can down the road, because that is very bad value for money, and that's not what we want to do. But right now, I'm glad that we have the optionality to come to this in the SR.
So General, when we look at this plan again next year, as is the routine of this committee, will you be able to be sat in front of us and say, since last year, the MOD has determined, through whichever ministerial decision, to end this, stop doing that, and will have brought at least the next 3 years of the plan into somewhere near balance? Because is that what you expect to be able to do in the next 12 months? Because otherwise, we're not actually progressing in terms of the plan being affordable.
Could I have a go at answering that for you? Because we're right in the middle of the planning process for setting a budget from the 1st of April next year. The next equipment plan, EP19, will be for the 1st of April for the year that follows. So it's unlikely that the spending review will have concluded by the time we produce the next version of the equipment plan. And if we produce it quicker than we did this year, then that certainly won't be contemporaneous. But just to go back to your question on when we make decisions, the fact every single year we set a budget, we make decisions, we prioritise our funding to make sure that we can deliver the programme of record that was set out in the SR. And every 5 years, or whenever government chooses, we then come back to look at the medium-term plan. This year, we've been able to secure enough funding through discussions at the autumn budget that means for 18-19 and for 19-20, we do not believe we have to make big capability decisions that impact on the Joint Force 2025 programme. As General Poffley said, though, we are constantly looking to make sure that any discretionary expenditure we can prioritise is focused on that programme of delivery.
I mean, the additional budget for this year doesn't come close to even making this year's balance. There's still work to do there, and I appreciate what you're saying, but I think the subtext of what you're telling me is that when we look at the Defence Equipment Plan 2019-2029, the NEO are going to come back and say it's still unaffordable, albeit by potentially a slightly smaller number than it is this year. And what I want to understand is, at what point will we have a Defence Equipment Plan in front of us that the NEO says, actually, this is affordable, or at least within the 4-year window that we actually look at, all the money that you need is there? Because at the moment, it isn't.
So it would be part of the spending review, which we would imagine would take effect from the 1st of April 2020. So the Equipment Plan 2020 and the 10-year forecast after that would be the next opportunity we have to put this equipment plan back into balance. But even that is the current process that government has for multi-year spending reviews.
So it is your personal ambition to make sure that you are the finance director at the Ministry of Defence that gets an equipment plan out there that's going to be within budget.
That has got to be our intention.
But nothing will. Just last question for me then.
Chapman.
But I mean, 2025. But what do you do in the interim? Because as the NAO points out, the place where the equipment plan is most out of balance is the next 4 years. So if you're saying that 2 of those 4 years before you're in balance, what are you going to do in the next 2 years to make sure that you can afford the equipment that you're planning, but also that you're not now starting to buy equipment and build equipment that after the CSR you decide to decommission because those large, longer-term capability decisions that you are, by own admission, putting off until after the review?
So in these first 2 financial periods, we're currently forecasting to balance our budget this year. You will know from the NEA report that we over-allocated by 1.2 billion. We were facing a 1.3 billion forecast deficit. We've done that in 2 different ways. One, we set really tight budgets with our top-level budget holders, and we've held them to account. And we've been much more robust in the way in which we performance manage people to their forecasts. We've also made some prioritisation decisions, and do you know what? Some of the things that we thought were going to happen haven't happened. So in any financial year, what we're trying to do is get the balance of programming choices made as early as possible, and we're trying to make sure that our forecasts and our cost estimates are much more robust. This is the first year in many years where we haven't had to make decisions in the middle of the financial period in order to bring the budget into balance. I'm very pleased to be able to say that we will bring us in on budget this year.
It's quite shocking. I mean, it's good news, but it's quite shocking that that's good news. How much approximately did you save through the performance management of individual budget holders?
So quite a lot of what we're doing is through forecasting accuracy rather than saying you can't spend money. We expect TRBs to prioritise their funding to deliver capability in the way in which we envisage.
Approximately of that.
So
1.3
around $1 billion of our underlying financial position has come from better forecasting, better cost estimation, much more realistic approaches to programmes.
So by keeping your BDI on people at an early stage and them knowing they have to plan properly, that's saved £1 billion, just to be...
I think it is starting to have an impact, yes.
And Lieutenant General Poffley is nodding for the record. Douglas Chapman.
Chair, may I just make a point about balance, bringing it into balance? Because I wouldn't want to set expectations which we might come to regret. If we end up in a position where a 10-year programme is exactly the same as the funds which are available to finance it, almost inevitably what will happen is that we'll have more funds than the programme. That is what has happened when it has been the case in the past. So while I do not at all feel comfortable with the over-programming position that we have at the moment, there's 7 billion, most of it in the first 4 years, I suspect that we will always be running with what we would hope would be a prudent level of over-programming, because just in the nature of things, in a programme with over 1,000 projects, all at very different levels of maturity, things slip. And so it's not right now, but I think that we will. I would not particularly like to have something which it balances exactly in every year of a 10-year programme, because if we don't actually spend the money, which I suspect in most instances we might not, we would then lose it, and that would not be good for defence.
When you say a prudent level of overcommitment or insufficient funds, what do you consider?
We're carrying it.
No, give me a number. Give me a number.
Well, it's difficult to be absolutely precise with that.
$1 billion?
Over a 10-year period, I think it's probably more likely it'll be more, I think, than 100 million, quite a lot more than 100 million. Probably
less than
more
$1 billion?
I don't know. I'd like to get back.
I hear what Mr. Zell's driving at, but I think there is also a challenge about what the risk profile of the programmes in there. So we know that you're not going to give an exact figure.
Because it depends.
Percentage-wise of the total budget?
Grove, you said a prudent, so you must have in your head a figure that you consider is prudent.
Well, the figure I have in my head, which I consider prudent, is certainly less than the figure that we are running with at the moment. What I would like to do is to do the work with better information about what our budgets are and how the projects are developing, because they are all at very different stages of maturity, and then get back to you. But that is what we're doing, and quite a lot of it is to go to what Ms. Little said. If our forecasting continues to improve at the rate at which it has gone over the last 18 months, then I suspect actually that obviously squeezes the amount of over-programming that you would be prepared to deal with. If we find it difficult to get forecasting sort of accelerating, then inevitably we might run a bit hotter.
So taking away the number of what is prudent, when would you expect to be at that prudent point? Ms. Little said 2020. By 2020, would that prudent...
I think so. I think every year you would want to see that number becoming smaller.
Let's pause and I'll move to Mr. Douglas Chapman.
Thanks very much. You mentioned just about the relationship between MOD and the Treasury. I just wondered, I think the general public opinion is that there seems to be no love lost between the two departments. But is that based on the fact that you persistently operate out with your current budget, as it were, in terms of potential for overspends? Or am I missing something? Or what kind of pressure is put on by the Treasury to make sure that you bring your potential budgets in the future in line?
Well, Ms. Little will certainly want to come in on this, but I would very much challenge the characterisation of the relationship with the Treasury. At official level, we work very, very closely with them. They are extremely good and valued colleagues.
For your relationship with the Treasury. make the begging bowl approach easier. Right, we can move on to answer the question.
They understand the nature of the pressures that we are under, and the budget settlement of last year was a very clear recognition of that. I don't think that they haven't put any particular special and different controls on us because of the fact that we are under some financial pressure at the moment. I mean, they expect me as the accounting officer to put those controls on the department to make sure that we don't bust our parliamentary limits, which, as I say, I know is the number one responsibility that I have. So I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with your characterisation.
I had at least two consecutive annual reports saying that our plan, our department plan, is unaffordable. Then I'd have some concerns about that. And the other issue would be, just as Mr. Snell pointed out, about the amount of money that needs to be allocated within that first 4-year period. We're going into possibly a 4-year period where the variables are going to be peaking all at the same time. We've got Brexit, which might have a huge detrimental effect on public finances. There's the issue around you choosing to purchase more equipment from suppliers out with the UK, which may have an impact in terms of foreign exchange risks that you face. So at the very time you're saying you can bring everything in on budget, you've got all these external factors that may give you real headaches and real problems. So how are you thinking about managing that process, given that you've got a 4-year window to sort that?
So our job is to prepare and plan for a range of plausible and realistic scenarios, and therefore we've given you the top end and what we think the bottom end of a scenario on the equipment plan is. Of course, we do that for the whole of the MOD budget. What you've got here is a snapshot of the 40% that we spend on equipment. Our job every single day is to make sure that we're mitigating financial risk, that we're making decisions, we're managing to live within our means, and I'm confident that we can do that in the next 2 years. Having said that, obviously there are shocks to the system, and you mentioned foreign exchange. It's absolutely fair to say that the sorts of volatility we're seeing in foreign exchange rates at the moment make it incredibly difficult for us to plan and mitigate those risks. So here today, I've got 80% of my financial risk exposure for Forex movement hedged. We try to mitigate it as much as we can. We put aside what we think is a sensible contingency to manage anything that's not been hedged. But to be honest, if we continue at the sort of rate where, today the exchange rate for the dollar is 1.38, we thought it was going to be 1.43. As we've said in the equipment plan, it doesn't take a lot for us to be significantly over our estimates. And of course, we haven't got bottomless reserves to be able to buy that out. So you're right to point it out, and there are risks that we're constantly having to talk to Treasury about.
And then turn, I suppose it's probably to Lieutenant General Poffley, but it might also maybe to Simon Bollam. As Ms Little said, 40% of the budget's on the equipment plan. How much flexibility is there elsewhere? Maybe it's Mr Lovegrove actually, to fill that gap in the equipment plan. What else could you not do? I mean, we know there's recruitment challenges in the armed forces, so there's personnel. There's also land issues, which we've discussed in other hearings. We don't need to go into the detail of that. Where would you see the best opportunity and flexibility to bail out the defence equipment plan if it came to it?
There is some flexibility to move resources from one part of the department's budget to another, but it's far from unlimited. Everything has a consequence. The easiest thing to clamp down on after you clamp down on unnecessary movements or travel and those kinds of things is training, actually, and that is something that people do with a great deal of reluctance for very obvious reasons. So we do have some flexibility. We have central contingency held, which we can place where we think it's needed most, but pretty much everything is under some degree of pressure. So it's in reality it's quite limited.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I'd endorse that. I think it is very limited in the short years because inevitably it's about the levels of commitment we've already played into our capital expenditure programme. So your sort of four main sources are obviously in the equipment and sport arena. And that support budget is driven by activity pretty much. So, but there are some things you can do in that space. The second is obviously in your personnel area, but again, that comes with some real difficulties in the short term, and it requires some structural changes if you want to do it into the longer term. But as you modernise the structure, we should be looking at more automation, which gives us some levers to play with. We've got an infrastructure programme, and we've got, of course, a raft of other sundry budget areas where you might be able to mine. But as the Permanent Secretary says, in the short term it's very limited because most of these require upfront investment in order to release some of that funding.
Perspective at DES, Department of Defence Equipment Support, what are the biggest risks in meeting Cat Little's challenge to make sure that it's all on track for 2020?
Well, I suppose really to follow up what has been said earlier on about equipment and support. It shouldn't be forgotten that nearly 50% of the EP is spent on equipment support and sustainability.
Challenges, the biggest challenges?
The challenges are, I would say, I mean, ideally, if you're putting in place a commercial arrangement with industry, to get best value from that, you'd want as long a sweep as you can to give predictability. So that's a risk. It requires me and my team really to front up with our industrial partners, ensure that we understand the cost base very clearly, that we understand what activity levels drive what costs, and what opportunities that we can exploit in order to meet the budgetary constraints. So very clear relationships with industrial partners is vital. And in terms of the commercial arrangements that we put in place, they need to be flexible, not only to meet budgetary impacts, but of course General Poffley here has got to have a flexible equipment programme to meet the threat. So I need to be able to respond to that in an agile way.
Relations issues a little later on. Now just, though, press you, Mr Lovegrove, you were talking about not having a fixed point in time, and we appreciate that a lot of this is dynamic, but it could sound like you're getting off the hook, because if there's no point, if it's a moving thing, is there any point in having a 10-year plan in the first place?
Yes, and I have to say that the discipline that has been brought into the programme since the 10-year plan has been published in the last 8 or 9 years, and the oversight that the NAO has brought to it has improved our appreciation of the levels of risk, and therefore has improved the planning processes that we go through at every stage. So I think it's absolutely imperative that we have a 10-year plan refreshed every year, accepting that it is a 10-year plan with some very dynamic and very complicated components to it. So I have no desire to move away from this at all. I think that would be a real mistake. It would make managing the department difficult.
In a way reassuring you say that, because I did wonder with the dynamic moving spiral whether there's ever a fixed point on that spiral which you have to get to Miss Little's point.
No, I mean it's a very fair point, but I mean the old thing, if you can't measure it you can't manage it. That is for sure the case here, but we do need to recognise.
I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere about Ministry of Defence's past handling of finances, but anyway.
Yes, I'm sure there is.
So Geoffrey.
General Poffley, how far does the plan include contingencies for a major deployment, something like the Afghan campaign or the Iraq campaign? Because clearly it's not only the cost of getting personnel and equipment into these campaigns, it's the cost of replacing equipment that is lost. So how far does the plan include that?
Well, every equipment programme within the plan has provision for, one, that level of attrition that you're describing, and it certainly makes assumptions about the relative deployment over a period of time of each of those equipments. I think it would be fair to say that the Modernising Defence programme has brought into stark relief that this part of the programme needs very clear attention given to it. And actually the recent exercise, both on exercise Trident Juncture, which was a NATO deployment up into the high north, and the Safe Syria deployment into Oman this summer, have demonstrated that actually these things are vitally important. So again, the thinking that comes out of those will refresh the provisioning factors that are applied to each of these support arrangements. So I think it is, it would be a very brave person to say you've got it absolutely right, because that assumes you can predict the future deployment activity. But it is an active ingredient of every single one of the programmes. And I am confident that given our scale of ambition at present, as articulated in the progress towards Joint Force 25, we have attended to that.
Changing nature of threat in the world at the moment, which seems to be increasing, isn't it essential that you do actually have an SDSR in 2020? Because otherwise the thinking, the last one, which informs your current budget, will be way out of date.
Well, I think it is certainly the case, as we have discovered in the work we've done this year, that there are certain areas of conflict which have accelerated away beyond that we had assumed in 2015. And I think this plays to this point about spiral analysis, that you've got to constantly refresh them. I mean, it's fascinating. When you talk about the 10-year plan, there are certain components of it that are pretty predictable. But there are some components of it where the refresh rate on technologies, for example, is accelerating well beyond that we had predicted even 2-3 years ago. So where we're looking to become more tutored in this is to be able to accommodate those different profiles and postures, and to make sure that we provision in sufficiently an open architecture way that you can accommodate the sorts of spiral development in, let's say, the IT world, where we're seeing a technological refresh rate which is exponentially different to that we had assumed 10 years ago, that those sorts of factors are fed into our thinking. And that means some parts of the programme will be relatively loose fit.
Okay. One of the big areas where you could save some money to fill the gap, maybe I'll kind of ask Mr. Lovegrove this, would be to today our Dreadnought and Astute programme. Is there any thought being given to that?
No, there isn't. Particularly with Dreadnought, a delay on the Dreadnought programme would mean that we would be placing our ability to maintain our primary operation in jeopardy, which is CASD. So quite the opposite. If anything, we would want to be accelerating expenditure on Dreadnought, and indeed that is the basis upon which some of the money that the Treasury has given us in the last year or so has been awarded. Likewise, the Astute programme is very important for not only protecting the deterrent, but also for a whole host of other tasks, and we really do want to make sure that those are delivered on time.
Douglas Chapman.
Yeah, just before we move on, just on the nuclear enterprise, obviously a huge chunk of the money and overall budget relates to the nuclear enterprise. What extent does the nuclear enterprise actually make the overall plan unaffordable? What's the, if we were taking a different route with that?
So since 2015, the nuclear enterprise has had cost growth of around £3 billion, so it contributes £3 out of the £7 billion affordability gap. It's also a very complex, big capital reinvestment programme over many, many years.
What's that percentage?
Well, it's around 40-ish% of the overall programme, and it contributes to about 40% of the deficit. Highly volatile, very complex, big levels of capitalisation, so you would expect it to be that way.
And the submarine programme as a category is twice as big as the next category. I mean, it's 44 billion of the 179, and
we may come back into it as well, but Mr. Chapman.
We'll come back to that, but I'm looking as well at the modernisation defence programme that was, or plan that was suggested last January. We then expected it in before summer recess, and we're still waiting for that to come out at the moment. I sense there's a degree of frustration, because how on earth can professional civil servants make decisions based on a policy that's just not there? So how have your decisions, or lack of them, added risk to the sort of value for money within the equipment plan in the longer term? How is that, by delaying these decisions, how does that actually work in the interests of the taxpayer in terms of you being able to spend money wisely?
So obviously when we make any decision about the equipment plan, we want to do it on a multi-year basis. One, it's obviously the right thing to do from a value for money perspective, and secondly, as Sir Simon mentioned, our industry partners are more likely to do a good deal with us if they can see the funding streams over a longer period of time. So it's incredibly challenging to get that balance right, but that is the nature of what we have to do. We have to balance short-term annuality, the need to live within our means, versus making sure that we're making the very best value for money decisions. We don't always get it right, but that in effect is what we have to do within government when you've got constrained resources.
Every time that a decision is either made or not made has a huge impact on the industry partners you're talking about. We've had in the last week or so, Babcock's closing down Appledore. We're sitting with a shipbuilding strategy that was approved by the government only 12 months ago, perhaps, or maybe a bit longer than that. But by not making the decisions and timely decisions in a sensible, logical progression of decision making, then you're actually impacting on the ability of your industry suppliers to actually deliver what we need them to deliver. And it's just that complete mismatch between what is required in terms of capability, how the process works in terms of the procurement, and the lack of decision making at the highest level, that it's just nothing seems to actually fit together to actually get the best value for the taxpayer out of how the department's currently operating.
Just very briefly, I think the most important thing is that 95% of the equipment plan is funded, and we want to give as much certainty as possible. So going back to why the equipment plan being publicly, transparently available is so important, is so that we can give as much certainty as we can. And of course, there's always going to be an element of uncertainty when you face a spending review and when you have to look at the resource constraints that you're facing.
A view on that?
In an ideal world, the greater the certainty, the easier it is. But don't forget that our key suppliers have been working with us for many years. And they will absolutely understand the nature of the military threat. They understand the affordability challenges. And I think, coming back to the spiral idea, they're well attuned to the fact that maybe they're not going to get the longest sweep in terms of a hard commercial arrangement. And we work closely with them to optimise that.
People around the country who are going to be losing their jobs because of the fact that we can't get a plan that actually makes any logical sense in terms of the timing of various projects. It just all seems to be done in a way that, from an outsider's point of view, it just seems completely haphazard.
Mr. Chapman's not talking about there is a policy element to this potentially, but it's actually about how you at DES and MOD generally manages the planning so that we don't have a gap in service and therefore a loss of
and you raise a good point about critical capabilities that exist in the UK sector, and I can only really repeat that this is a constant dialogue. So I'm constantly in dialogue with my industrial partners.
And what about your dialogue with the MOD?
Well, I wouldn't say a daily, I'd say an hourly basis in that sense. So I like to think that Mr Lovegrove, Ms Little and the General here absolutely understand where we have critical pinch points in industry. Sometimes it's not always the military capability that drives it, but it will be the industrial imperative as well, and we have to make those difficult choices.
Okay, so my organisation is charged with delivering two things in this sort of part of the debate. The first is the retention of operational advantage. So we must recognise the imperative of industry to have a full order book, but by the same token, my job is to make sure that we send people to war with the right equipment and the right preparation. That said, in the transparent nature in which we are now talking to industry in a way that we were not, frankly, 5 years ago, we are having an open conversation about what we think the nature of conflict is going to look like into the future, and therefore they can adjust their provision to us in a sensible way. The second component that we are charged with delivering is sovereign choice, and that means that I, wherever possible, do not want to be beholden to single suppliers, or at least where I am, I'm absolutely cognizant that we make provision for that so that we retain the sovereign advantage that I spoke about earlier. And that's important because it may be that there are certain skill sets in the portfolio of the industry that genuinely require support from the state rather than to being able to survive on their basis. But I have to tell you, that's a very, very, very small community.
I wanted to come in on this point.
The issue that Mr. Chapman raises is a very real one, and I think we, along with the whole of government, recognise that managing our strategic suppliers better is something that has to be a priority. So one of the key strands in the modernising defence programme, because there are only 4, was in fact strategic supplier management, and we've been working very closely with the Cabinet Office to put a degree of order and predictability around that, which will go, I hope, over a period of time to allay some of the fears that you have. Because from our perspective, what we need to do is to make sure that we are behaving as a demanding but sympathetic client to these very important British companies and the people who work for them, and a rather more holistic approach to it and to each of the strategic suppliers has been rather overdue. But we are all on this table and elsewhere working hard at that.
And have you ever made a decision for industry to keep that capability going as a priority over operation?
It tends to be in very niche specialised capabilities which tend to be at the higher end of classification, so we tend not to advertise them that greatly.
I'm just going to bring in Gareth Snell sorry, Ms. Little very briefly because we're just aware of time. Gareth Snell's got a quick point and I'll come back to Mr. Chapman.
To say this, but not at any cost. So we would always do that as long as it offered value for money overall. And it's a really difficult trade-off.
I have to say that I think probably you're talking to a bunch of MPs, some of us have in our constituencies industry. There's actually more sympathy than you might realise for us to make sure that our industry is able to deliver, not at any cost, but as one of the considerations, as Mr. Chapman's highlighted. Mr. Snell briefly and then back to Mr. Chapman.
I mean, General, you mentioned the single source office. When this committee looked at the single source office, one of the recommendations we came to was that unless the MOD joined up its plans to make sure there were longer term interests for R&D funding, the single source office would have a greater role in determining what you could buy rather than competition and choice, which I think was accepted by the MOD at the time. But my question is more around skills. If we are not keeping certain industries, shipyards, companies going, yes, the jobs go, but the skill set loses as well, and then we do become beholden to the Americans. So if we don't get this right, aren't we actually just outsourcing procurement to the Pentagon, because all of a sudden the Americans become the only game in town in terms of providing stuff?
I don't think they are the only game in town, but the underlying point you make is absolutely right. Part of the preservation of sovereign choice is precisely that, to make sure that we have choice into the future. That does require us to maintain certain skills inside our industrial base.
I was at Wharton on Friday of last week, where the Typhoons are made, and the latest ideas for the future of combat air are being developed by BAE, and much of the discussion I had that day was with the management about how we could make sure that those very rare and very sophisticated skills in the development of fighter aircraft are maintained, so that we actually have optionality around that. Because if we are unthinking about it, we may lose it.
Mr. Chapman. Mr. Chapman.
Yeah, thanks. A question about Mr. Poffley. How can you be confident that the 1.3 billion affordability gap in 18-19 can be successfully managed through without any detrimental effect actually on capability itself?
We work hard to make sure that we do as much as we can to avoid that. It would be wrong to say to you that I can guarantee that that will not roll out. But we do have choices in managing that. Firstly, we can look at, and I think Ms Little mentioned it earlier on, this notion of forecasting. How accurate are the costings that we've got? We've seen us improve in that regard incrementally over the course of this year, and certainly our ambition is for that to continue. There is certainly work underway to look at the support arrangements and the efficiencies associated with these programmes. And again, there's a negotiation to be had with industry to see whether we can amortise some of the costs associated with the programme over a different set of years. So this notion of annuality that we're encumbered with regularly is now a more proactive conversation as we take forward our strategic supplier management arrangements. So I am confident that we can make real headroom with regard to that 1.3. Can I give you an assurance that there will never be a detrimental effect to any piece of capability? Well, I'm afraid I can't, but we'll do our level best to make sure there isn't.
How some of the decision making may have a detrimental impact on increasing costs in the longer run, and maybe think about some of the work that needs to be done on the Type 26s, for example. The Type 23s, which are presumably some of them reaching the end of their normal lifespan. And the committee's already committed and published a report on cannibalisation of ships, for example. And I'm sure if it's happening in the Navy, it's happening elsewhere across other services. So are these not just an indicator that the money is not being well spent because of the lack of decision making at a higher level?
Well, I think there is certainly a case intuitively you would expect that if you're going to defer a decision, there's a fair chance some of this will be value destructive. I think one needs to be careful because some of these areas are so fast moving. You talk about the Type 23. Part of the shipbuilding strategy work, indeed I'm chairing a meeting tomorrow on precisely this, is to work out what's the optimum point at which a platform like that, which is a legacy capability, what are the additional costs of actually continuing to run it in the form that we've got in the programme or not? And therefore there's a constant conversation which includes an assessment of how value destructive a deferral or a delay would be. And of course they're taken on a case-by-case basis. And in some cases we're accelerating the out of service of some programmes in order to avoid that sort of effect manifesting itself.
Yeah, but in saying that, there was a NATO exercise a few months ago where the Royal Navy could not supply any ships to take part in that. The
demand signal on the Royal Navy is acute, and that's a known fact.
Forgive me, and I think I think that should be a bit of a flag up to say if we can't send one ship to take part in a NATO exercise and offer coasts. It wasn't as if it was in another part of the world. It wasn't in the Mediterranean or moving into the Black Sea. It was off our coast, and yet we couldn't supply one ship. I think that's a real concern. I think in terms of
I think
our capability and what you're saying about the budget.
Without really understanding the particular tasking you're referring to, I think we're wrong to characterise at any point in the recent history where we have not been able to deploy significant components of the fleet. There are choices about which deployments you send them on, and it may well be that the tasks associated with the fleet on that particular period meant that that was not a priority for us in the Royal Navy. Now, I have explained that part of what we are looking to do to counter the threat, particularly in the subsurface arena, has put pressure on the fleet, but we have to prioritise those tasks. And as Mr Lovegrove's already pointed out, some of those tasks are very much a higher priority than others. And I suspect there was a judgment at play as to which one you were going to do. But that would be the case no matter how large the fleet was.
I'll come back.
I just wanted to go back to you, Ms Little, about your projected position on a 10-year plan. How much of that will rely, do you think, on deletions of projects? I mean, are you planning, you've got to live within your means, but just push both you and Mr Lovegrove. Do you think there will be things that we actually have to stop doing in order to meet the plan? I mean, obviously, depending on the outcome of, I know there's lots of ifs and buts in this, but can we afford to keep doing what we're doing?
So there's always a combination of things that we have to do. We talk about the 3Ds of deletion, descoping and deferral. As Mr Lovegrove said, actually our preference is to stop doing things or not start. So quite a lot of what we do is look at our uncommitted expenditure where we've got discretion and we choose not to start things. So it's inevitable that you're going to have to do a balance of all of those things in order to bring the programme into balance if further funding isn't provided.
You're trying to project a position over a decade in financial terms, or 5 years in the short term, or and then every year. Are you hampered, frankly, by the fact that you have to balance the budget every year? You can't carry over in a way that in other organisations that might be possible?
Yes, very simply. It's, as much as I greatly respect the need to annually live within our means and comply with the vote of parliamentary supply, at the end of the day, such a large part of our programme is capital intensive, hugely volatile. It is highly unusual in this type of business to not be able to move funds between years to manage that level of volatility. So it's inevitable that you're constantly trading off short-term versus long-term decision-making.
Which brings me back to the point about a 10-year programme, Mr Lovegrove. You said it was important to have it as a sort of, I suppose, to keep your nose to the grindstone and making sure you're within budget, but you've got the annual budget planning. So, we look at all of these. So we've got, as I've gone through it before, modernising defence, less about the money, spending review, SDSR, annual budgets, 10-year plans. I mean, you've got this mishmash of timescales, budgets. Do you think, in your ideal world, you want to see a change to how that works? And what would be your ideal world?
In an ideal world, we would have a smoother rhythm of planning exercises than we have at the moment. But, we don't live in an ideal world, and the job of me and the team is to make sure that if we do have occasionally jarring exercises that we need to manage for, that they are coordinated and made to make sense across the whole, and that is a lot of what we do.
And headroom is little. I mean, a removal of headroom gives you less scope for manoeuvre. How's that going to affect your ability to balance the budget? How are you managing that?
Sorry, just to make sure I understand. So when you talk about headroom,
Well, there's no... Emerging programme commitments haven't got any headroom within the plan, have they?
No. So we do have some contingency, but it's by far not enough to manage the level of financial risk or funding gap that we've got.
Yeah.
So ideally, we would have some contingency to manage that movement between years in the absence of funding flexibility. I mean, there are programmes across government where that sort of flexibility is permitted. There aren't that many, but big complex mega projects, I think, benefit from having that level of flexibility, and I think we have a number which would fit with an argument with Treasury that sort of funding flexibility should be allowed.
Are you arguing with Treasury about this?
We're not arguing with Treasury about it. We have
putting your case to Treasury.
We've absolutely set out a case for our nuclear programmes in particular.
Yeah. Okay, and how are those conversations going?
They are ongoing.
So we're looking at spending review decision time.
It is highly likely that sort of multi-year big material decision can only be looked at in a spending review.
Okay, so we'll wait till spring, summer, whenever next year. So Geoffrey,
your budgeting on these plans, how close is your budgeted costs to the actual delivery costs?
So there's a whole range. We have about 2,000 project lines that we monitor. Some are fairly close, some are significantly adrift. The standards that we put in place is within 6 months we expect all forecasts to be within 1%. and we monitor that on a monthly basis, and we talk to programme teams about why their variances are out. Obviously, at the end of the day, it depends on why. Some things are out of people's control. It might be a supplier not being able to deliver something. It might be a programme team misestimating when something might be done. And sometimes it's our costing and estimates that are out. But we try to get it within 1% 6 months away from a forecast.
So how close are you to meeting that 1%, do you think?
Well, obviously, we are required to live within 1%. Treasury assesses quite stringent rules every single year. This year, I do expect us to be within 1%, as we were last year.
I just wanted to, I don't know which of you, if any of you are an expert on radar, but we've had some evidence from United Union about the government's plans to invest in radar. And we understand that BAE Systems has invested around 5 million so far. The government was being asked to invest 10 million over 4 years, which will be matched by BAE Systems. And that, at the moment, the government is not mindful to invest, this is their words, though we understand it's committed to a long-term review of radar. So there is a long-term review of radar. I'm sure that's correct, Mr. Lovegrove.
No, I was going to say that I can assure you who isn't an expert in radar.
Okay.
And that's so,
Stepping backwards, does that mean, Lieutenant General Poffley, you've had to step forward on this?
Well, I think Mr. Bolland will make one commentary, and then I'll perhaps add a little bit of flavour from the capability point of view.
So, radar is one of those high-end areas where we've got to be very careful in terms of making sure that we get the funding flow through to those capabilities to match our sovereignty requirements. Complex radar, which you're referring to, I think, in the context of the BAE Systems there. There are a number of capabilities in the UK that provide that. And we're in dialogue with BAE Systems at the moment. I'm not aware that anybody has said no to anything, but you put your finger on one of those particular areas where, in fact, I've got a number of conversations which probably wouldn't be appropriate to go into right now around the table this week, in fact, to talk about what's on offer and what could be done. And in that one, I'll be working very close with General Poffley. What we must make sure we do is not step off or step past the point of no return unconsciously.
Which raises, how aware are you of the workforce profile of those working in radar, particularly at Cowes and at Great Badger?
Well, I couldn't give you the workforce profile.
But are you having those sort of conversations?
Absolutely, and I'm having one this week, in fact.
So you're aware that what the union says that over a third of the engineers at those sites, that's Cowes and Great Barrow, are within 5 years of retirement. So that could put at risk.
Engineers.
Yes, the engineers.
The engineering demographic. I mean, that's a generic problem that we have in this country and all engineering sectors. The demographic is...
so we know that. So that's an issue. So is that helping to shape your thinking on how we deal with radar?
It certainly is, and the Cowes facility that you refer to is actually quite a small facility, and it delivers some important capability in support of the Type 45 frigate, for example. And we now need to take that long-term view of how do we sustain the in-service capability, and how do we provide the technology that we're going to need into the future to meet the capability.
It's not just how, though, isn't it? The timings matter. A delay,
absolutely.
A government review of several months can have a very big knock-on impact on.
Well,
I'm using this as an example.
Yeah, no, it's a very good example in my view, and we will come to a view. As I said, I'll talk to General Poffley about the capability need, and then Ms. Little, as the guardian of the purse here, we will make whatever decisions are appropriate to retain the capability that we need.
I would add only a little. The first is that this is a real area in which operational advantage really plays. It's also an area where there's some very high-end science that is not unique to the United Kingdom, incidentally, and is not unique to the United States as an alternative, just to provide that reassurance. There are some genuine capability benefits inside British industry, and we are looking to make sure we maximise those. We're also, and it's fascinating sitting where we are, we get visibility of most industrial suppliers' ambitions in this space, And of course, not all of those suppliers talk to each other because they want to preserve their commercial and competitive position. So one of the things we are doing is distilling down who has actually got capability worth retaining. Where they haven't, what can we do to improve it, to provide greater choice for us going forward whilst obtaining that operational advantage. But some of these technologies are really cutting edge, and certainly DSTL, our science and technology folk, are very closely engaged with a number of countries and a number of companies to make sure that we maximise the benefit of this. When it comes to preserving skills, there is definitely an agenda here, as there are in many other places, where we are going to have to look collectively at how we take this sort of technology forward and preserve the choice of British companies inside that portfolio. And it's across all environments. It's not just in the air sector. It applies equally elsewhere.
But Mr. Grove, do pass it along if it's not you. The technology for radar has obviously got a specific, very definite military application, but there can be other applications of some of our cutting-edge technology and science in industry that is predominantly defence. Do you look across government and talk to other departments about industrial strategy and support? I know there's a strand. I know there's some of this you do, but can you explain to us how you do that to make sure that if you withdraw a bit, it's not going to completely lose that capability, or indeed vice versa, that other bits of government don't withdraw their support or procurement from certain types of industry in order to preserve some of that capability for the MOD?
We do. Should we do more of it? I think personally we should. The industrial strategies, the industrial policy, industrial strategies that the government has at the moment provides us with a forum and a framework for doing that. We, as you know, have a nuclear strand, we have a shipbuilding strand, we have an aerospace strand, which we are standing up at the moment, and I just recently written to my counterparts in 6 other departments on the aerospace strand to tell them what we are doing and how they need to play into it, and to provide points of contact so that we can make sure that we take on board their important interests in it. I think it's probably more effective at the very big sector strategies. I think it's probably more effective at that shipbuilding level, at the aerospace level, than possibly something which is a little bit more niche, but very important, like radar. And I'm happy to take that away and see whether or not we can improve at that level.
And I feel a recommendation may be coming on, Mr. Snell.
A brief question, High Chair. To Simon, to Stephen, I don't disagree with anything that you have said, but where I think there is a glaring omission in this, and it goes back to the very earliest questions we asked, it is all well and good having a strategy, a defence air strategy, a defence maritime strategy, a defence industrial strategy, but until the department actually makes some decisions about what platforms it wants and what those platforms will be used for, all of this stuff is just paperwork on a desk. It doesn't actually lead to anything. So how are you making sure that the preparatory works that you're doing through these industrial strategies are actually going to link up with the decisions that you plan to make in 2020 about the platforms that you wish to have? Because otherwise we could have the situation, as General Poffley pointed out, equipment not being deployed to save costs that we've paid a lot of money for. So, for instance, we could see £3 billion worth of aircraft carrier not being deployed at a cost of £1 million a day, I was told, possibly. Yeah. And there seems to me to be that the one thing that your department has to do is decide what platforms it actually wants, and then all of these strategies will work in place. But until you get to that point, having other departments ready to feed into a strategy without actually knowing what you're building and buying is all a little bit woolly.
The Future Combat Air Strategy, as an example, right now, given the absolute centrality of that to everything that the country is trying to do in defence, even though we are not 100% sure exactly how that will play out, we would still be investing the comparatively small amounts of money at this stage in the next couple of years in order to be able to make sure that we had done the preparatory thinking. We would not want to lose 2 years of thinking time, planning time, and discussion time, building the international alliances, all those kinds of things which would enable resource decisions to be taken at a much higher level of materiality in a couple of years' time. These are very long-term programs.
Those alliances are different. So, I know we're going to get onto the F-35s later. Whether we decide to buy A's or B's has a huge impact on the cost of that long-term program, has a huge impact on whether they become an RAF or a naval asset, has a huge impact on which British companies are building what, because the A's are not built in the same way that the B's, has a huge interest on our Tier 2 status later on down the supply chain. All these decisions need to be taken now, because some of this stuff isn't going to work out otherwise.
They don't need to be taken now with respect, Mrs. Now, I mean, we know the first batch of 48, which we're on contract for and we're committed to, are all going to be Bs.
And the other 90?
That is a decision that
hasn't been taken.
That has not been taken, but does it need to be taken now? No, it doesn't. I'm not sure quite exactly when you would say that it needs to be taken.
No, in terms of preserving certainly British industries' equities in that, the difference between A and a B is not material to the production line necessarily in UK.
We had a briefing on this, which we can't talk about everything.
Because we build the Bs, don't we?
We build parts of Bs.
We build the back end.
So if suddenly we start ordering lots more A's than Bs, and the demand for Bs goes down.
Anyone watching this will wonder. I think we're all doing Sesame Street alphabet, if not careful. So perhaps
who's the count? That's the question, isn't it? You know.
Explain what you mean by the A's and Bs, just to be clear for anyone listening.
F-35A, Type A or Type B. So the A's that do conventional landing and B's that do the horizontal landing and are used for the carriers. So if we decide to upscale A and downscale B, or we decide not to do B, and therefore the demand for Bs goes down, there's an impact on British industry. There's also an impact on the Navy versus the RAF, which is a different competition that obviously you have to referee internally. But all of these decisions have long-term consequential knock-on effects.
Do you agree with Mr. Stell on the impact on industry of a change in balance?
I think the change in balance is an interesting one for British industry as to whether British industry's equity are in the entire order book of those aircraft across the world, because it has a 15% share of every aircraft that's built. Where the issue for us will become pertinent is the point at which we're running two fleets will be an issue, because quite clearly you have different support arrangements for two fleets rather than one. And secondly, the procurement costs of an A is cheaper item for item than a B, because it's a less complicated aircraft. So there are some issues there, but whether that's necessarily going to manifest itself on British industry on our choice, if the international partners that are currently buying the F-35 change their order book, that has a collective, and by volume and indeed by type, but not necessarily for the UK on the AB conversation, if there is a change in the volume of order, that quite clearly is going to have an impact on all of the partners.
Because we're not doing the F-35, my point is, though, there are certain decisions that need to be made within your department that have a longer-term impact. And the A's and the B's is actually putting aside the planes themselves, whether that then becomes a naval or an air force asset, whether that becomes what the support arrangements are, that has a longer-term impact on your equipment plan now, which you cannot answer or determine what that will be, because you don't know what you're going to be supporting. And that's where I think there is a mismatch in this whole conversation.
Okay.
Yes, you have plans for how you want to hedge money and do various things, but until the department decides what platforms it wants and how many of them it does want, a lot of this is very academic.
Okay, so I take the point that beyond 2024, i.e. beyond the first 48 being delivered, which are all going to be Bs for the avoidance of any doubt, then there is a question, and I acknowledge that at the point at which you make a decision on the variant types, which incidentally I think it would be very odd if we only stayed at 48 B models, but let's wait until we've done the analysis and confirmed our order.
But not impossible, really.
Pretty remote, I would suggest. Then there is a question for us quite clearly about the support arrangements associated with running two fleets. I acknowledge that.
Yeah. Can I just...
yes, we're going to
just on
Douglas Chapman wants to pick up on the F-35
and the impact on industry. UK and industry, and the evidence we gave a couple of weeks ago we're in for approximately 15% of the overall work share, and so that's on an off-take of something in the order of 3,000 aircraft. So what proportion of A's and B's the UK takes has little material difference, and you'll probably know that the main industrial activity associated with the production is up at Samlesbury in terms of aircraft build, and that factory there delivers the back end of all the F-35s.
Suggests there's an ongoing debate. I'm just looking at a note here from Deborah Haynes, who's given a quote here. If the F-35s can't fly from aircraft carriers, it shouldn't be purchased. So that's coming from maybe an RAF, unofficial RAF source. But nevertheless, I think it just points to how we come to a decision about capability, and if there's already indecision within the services, then that again is a concern. But I can maybe move on to a part of the NAO report we're here to discuss today. The part says that part of the 2018 plan includes a £21.2 billion worth of less mature cost forecasts. So what is the point, and when do we reach the point when we'll know that is sufficient, or whether we actually need a bigger budget to carry forward some of these projects?
So that is just a feature of different programmes and different stages of their maturity, and you'll always get that sort of blend in a programme of this size. So the 20-odd billion that's referred to tends to be the programmes that are managed directly by our top-level budgets. They aren't yet into a delivery agent. They're currently maturing what they need when they need it, and going through a costing process. So all of them will be tracked, and they'll mature over time.
General Geoffrey, what are the main programmes that have immature costings at the moment that we should be concerned about?
Well, I think costings that are maturing, whether they are immature is a relative judgment, of course. Inevitably, as we use new equipment, I mean, we've just had a very successful deployment of the carrier across to the east coast of the United States. But in sailing her, we have learnt an awful lot about her. In flying the F-35s off her, we've learnt an awful lot, as have our American counterparts in that. As the Americans fly our F-35 variant, they are similarly learning some very important lessons for support and maintenance of those sorts of platforms. So I think any big program where you have got new technology being introduced, which inevitably comes with some proving requirements, then of course there's a level of immaturity around the costings. So I think if you take any of our big programs, until they have been run out for a few years, there's always going to be some uncertainty as to whether the assumptions upon which you have made are going to be borne out. My really clear view is that actually some of the work we now do in our concept and assessment phases for new programs is taking reliability and support costs very firmly and high profile into the costing work that's being done. Have we got this right yet? Absolutely not. There's more work to be done, and that goes to the heart of these forecast costs issues that Ms Little described earlier on.
Ms Little, how you assess the assessment of, how you assure yourself about the assessment of reliability, because that is pretty big.
Yes. So there are a variety of assurance processes. The main one is our independent costing service, where we select a range of programmes over a 3 to 5 year period, and we get independent, what we call realistic outturn costs.
That's independent of the MOD or the original programme director?
They sit under the DNS at the moment. Actually, we're bringing them into the head office because they provide a service for the whole of Defence. They operate under ISO 9000 quality standards. They are externally assessed every single year to make sure they meet those independent costing quality standards. And they have a steering group that I chair, but it has representatives from across the department to make sure that we're able to see their work and to assess it. So it's quite a specialist thing, costing some of the things that we produce. And we actually work with colleagues around the world in the Five Eyes to compare and contrast our costing approaches on a regular basis. That's our main source of it, but at the Investment Approval Committee, which I chair, we also look at a range of costing methodologies. So we'll look at what we call the probability 50 and 90 levels, and we'll take a judgment as to whether we think that that brings the right level of risk, the right level of maturity, the right level of assumptions as part of the approval process.
You're looking at aircraft reliability, so therefore the knock-on potential cost of maintenance. Can you give us just some more sort of, in human terms, examples of what you might be assuring yourself of that Lieutenant Boffey or Simon Bolland's team have dealt with?
Something like the Type 31, the 1.5 billion that we've included within the equipment plan also has a corresponding service line within the Navy Command's budget, and we're constantly looking at whether the costs for support and sustainment are matching the useful economic life of the capital investment that we are spending money on.
Their existing expenditure, and from that extrapolating the future cost might.
So we look at the whole life cost, and we use something called the CADMID cycle, which stands for concept, assessment, design, manufacture, in-service and disposal. And every single one of those phases is costed and assessed whenever we make an investment approval decision.
Mr. Chapman.
Yeah, just on, since you mentioned Type 31s, you know, that came as a, you know, it was an announcement that was made, and then, but there was nothing actually in, I think, last year's accounts to make an allowance for that. Is there anything in the current plan looking forward that you know, would come as a surprise as work that's being done, but there's not a budget line for it?
No. The NEO have looked at the completeness of our plan. You're right, last year we were out of sync in the timing of the decision about the Type 31. It's now fully included within the plan. I think the equipment plan is complete.
Ms. Little, you've talked quite a bit about the skills earlier on you mentioned about the skill sets that you need. Do you think you have yet got the skill sets in the department that you need to manage the efficiency and outturn of the plan effectively?
This is a really important area of focus for us, and I think it's fair to say the whole of the cross-government finance profession is facing both gaps and different skill sets, and we need to evolve, and we work across the whole of government.
So the answer is not yet?
Not yet, but we have plans, as you would expect.
Yeah.
So we have a financial management improvement plan, we have a functional plan for the 3,000 finance professionals that sit within the Ministry of Defence, we have new investment in IT, and of course we work cross-government to try and recruit and retain
this is all good
talent.
stuff, but I've been on this committee, I've had the privilege of being on this committee since 2011. So Geoffrey was on this committee, I think, originally 20 years ago, and we've both seen, I'm afraid, you know, a lot of promises about improving the capability. So in the last 7.5 years or so, 7 years as I've been on, why are we still, what's the problem, what's the barrier of getting these skills in place?
So I would argue there have been quite a lot of changes. You know, I think, you know, just this year alone we've recruited 6 new finance directors. I don't doubt, I mean,
we've seen a trajectory, but how long is it going to take, I suppose, to get to the final point of having the right skills? So I set out to our independent audit committee last year a plan that will evolve over the next 5 years. We would expect to see significant improvements in the next 3. And I'd like to see assurance levels across everything we do in financial management improve to a much higher level in 5. Okay, so I'm just bringing to Simon Bullen, and then and what about in DNS, which has had its ups and downs, shall I say? Now you're in the hot seat. So how have you got the skills that you need? I think you're bringing a lot more people in now.
I'd never be satisfied with the skill levels we've got. There's always more to do, and you'll know that for 4 years now we've been undergoing a very comprehensive reskilling of the workforce, which I think in terms of efficiencies that we've delivered, our programme adherence is showing some encouraging signs.
Particularly, I mean, even more so than having to compete with industry.
Well, that's absolutely the point. You upskill people, and they become desirable. So we've got to make sure it's a full package here. It's about attraction, it's about training, and it's about retention. But I would add 2 other key areas to Ms. Little's finance function, and that's commercial and project controls and project management, and that is where in the DNS we've invested significantly in upskilling the workforce, our programme management, putting in place modern systems that can track accurately these large programs.
Mr. Snell wanted to come in briefly on this.
No, I just always chat. Whenever someone says significant, I always like to try and quantify what that means. So when you say a significant level of improved skills, what does that mean in terms of something that's tangible, that's quantifiable, that's...
Measures we've put in place are partly about our external assurance. So we use both NEO assurance on our financial statements every year. So at the moment, I would like to see the number of adjustments, the number of mistakes and errors reported in our accounts brought down. We've got measures about the number of qualified people within the department. At the moment, it's around 41%. We'd like it to be much, much higher. We think, so I can go through pretty much every single bit of our...
Examples, so that we can get a flavour of
They're
the
just
time.
a couple. I think our forecasting accuracy
Sorry, so
needs...
when you say from 41 to much, much higher, what does much, much higher than 41 look like? Is it 40?
60% is our current target. Okay. So, we try to use smart metrics wherever we can, but I think also we rely on the internal audit function who give us external independent assurance over our financial management. At the moment, we have got some gaps, and I would like our internal auditors telling us that we've got significant assurance across the piece.
Okay. That it has to be said, is not solely the case with finance. We have a transformation theme going on in the department as well, underneath our Chief Operating Officer, and he is recruiting very heavily to get properly qualified people to help him do that. Likewise in the commercial strand as well. So on any number of fronts, there is a functional sort of kind of upgunning, basically. And sometimes it has to be said I don't approve as much as they would like because we haven't got the money to be able to do it, but that is the nature of it.
This is an issue we take up across government.
Yeah.
We share some of those concerns. Can I just ask then, Sir Simon, what are the main programmes in your in the plan where you think we've been over-optimistic on costs? Brought up to us.
The main programmes in terms of over-optimism on costs.
Yeah, I mean, maybe you haven't been over-optimistic, but you haven't achieved the cost savings that you'd hoped to. Either answer to either or both of those will do for starters.
I don't think. I like to think that we have now got a very much more mature costing system and costing regime, and it's already been mentioned that we're held to task very significantly now by our own internal cost estimating, the CAS cost review team. And I think the NAO highlighted this year that there's a discrepancy of somewhere in the order of 3 billion between our costings and those that the CAS team have forecast. I don't think so. That gap is narrowing, and I think that's evidence that we're getting better at the job across the portfolio. And I think that what we have got is a very useful internal challenge function where we'll cost in generally a bottom-up way, and the CAS team may use some parametric approaches. And what it does importantly is forces us to look very carefully at the risks that are inside the programme.
Those two budget.
No, to be honest, if they ever aligned, it almost defeats the object of having the challenge. And I think what we have is a very healthy challenge function. As I say, on a large programme, if there's a discrepancy, it causes my teams to look at why that discrepancy is.
So, can you give us an example of when your team that hasn't aligned and your team's gone back to find something that they could have taken out the first time around?
Well, I would say that the early days of the F-35 programme was a very good example of where we had, shall we say, some very extensive dialogue on a programme where there was a large amount of uncertainty. As it happens, in terms of the cost adherence, in terms of the purchase of the aircraft, that has been pretty much exactly as predicted by...
Did the CAS system predict a different
Yeah,
cost? And did that make you change? What did you actually? Can you just talk us through what you did to?
So on that particular example, clearly the US managed that programme, and to some extent we're a price taker. And they've produced a prediction on what the unit price will be over the duration of the programme. And the cost assurance team were very challenging on that. Challenging in a way that allowed us to go back to the US and say, look, you know, there's some risks that we don't think that...
I mean, they had good data, good evidence. Yeah, what was it that was the
right? Well, so
that helped you in negotiations
in those early days. And this is just one part of the spectrum. It's the parametric model. So they take a wide range of platforms throughout the world. They'll get open source data. They've got the data we've got, for example, on Typhoon, and they will make certain predictions as to what cost outturns would be, normally speaking. And it really then forces us to justify the bottom-up costs that go into the programme. And I have to say that process was particularly healthy because, as I say, what they were able to do was flag up a number of areas where there didn't seem to be the right evidence, which enabled us to go back into the US programme, challenge industry, and get those risks out. So I think that was a very constructive and healthy interface between ourselves and an independent cost assurer. And as a result, that programme is actually running ahead of schedule in terms of cost.
So Gareth Snell, did you want to come in?
You kind of... That's all... What you've said there, Simon, is almost entirely couched in hyperbole and cliches, because you talk about extensive, you talk about very challenging, we talk about large amounts of things. What I want to understand is, how do you quantify and actually ensure that you have, that what you say is very challenging, that what you say is a large amount is a large, because the metrics to this all seem to be very much wet finger in the air, and if it's good, then it's very good, and if it's not good, it's okay. And I just, there seems to be a lack of, there seems to be a lack of being able to put our finger on a number and say that is the target to which you have to work up or down. There's lots of, and I get that some of this stuff is fluid, but so that one example is a bit. You've got another example that gives a more concrete demonstration of where your team has gone in, seen something, taken certain actions that's led to an outcome.
Okay, so probably the best example is the recent one on the Poseidon, the P8 aircraft, where we've got an initial set of costings from the US Navy. The CAS team were able to do their own independent cost estimate of that platform. That was a particularly good example where they identified a number of efficiencies that the US Navy could deliver across not just our aircraft fleet, but the whole of the production run. And as a result, we've made a very significant efficiency saving. So
I don't think
in excess of 200 million.
So when it goes into that, do they have a figure in mind? Do they have because the baseline is when they take something else open source and model it up?
So that's a good example where it's a 737 aircraft. Yeah. So in terms of the air vehicle, you can get some open source costings. We know what systems are fitted into that. So again, you can do some parametric comparisons of what a radar would cost to integrate. So you build up parametrically what we would call a should cost model. Right. And depending where you are on there, we would use that to challenge an industry bid and enter into a negotiation.
So you basically take the sum of the parts, work out the sum of the whole.
It's not quite as simple as that.
And I'm not being pedantic,
The simple, do you understand terms? So
and then
to be fair.
go back with that figure and say, could it be more to this?
Yeah,
than
we'll
that?
call it a should cost figure. Yeah.
Fine.
Thanks very much. We've talked quite a bit about the expenditure end of the budget and the equipment plan. I just wanted to ask a few questions just about the savings that were also planned within the plan as well. There's a residual 6.1 billion of efficiencies that your budget assumes to have secured. I just wonder how confident you are in delivering the 6.1 billion, or is this a bit of a pipe dream in terms of the actual delivery of that programme?
So if I start, and I'm sure others will want to add. So of the 6.1 remaining, we've disclosed that we've included 2.2 billion of that from further work that we've done with the DNS, that we're confident we will have plans in place to deliver. That was out of a 4.1 billion pool. We weren't confident to include the whole 4.1. And I think looking back at some of the lessons of the past and the SR15, it was clear that we banked large efficiencies to partly pay for investments, not all of which had been fully assured. And
Even if they didn't.
I wasn't there at the time,
No,
but it is clear
I am just simply summarising this. I think exactly what you're saying.
I think there are some numbers in there I would have preferred to have greater assurance over. So I think what we've done here is taken an assured approach to numbers we're willing to bank and those that we're not. And so we do have a gap. So there is still 3.9 billion remaining. We've recently started a transformation programme which the Permanent Secretary alluded to earlier, which looks at a number of cross-cutting options across defence where we are looking to find further savings. But it's clear to us that unless we actually change the way we do things, we're not going to be able to sustainably reduce the cost base. Gone are the days where you can just kind of take out cuts. Really what we need to do is transform the way of doing business, automate things, be much more digital, much more productive, more efficient. That's going to need some investment, and it's going to need time to deliver further savings off the back of it. That work is being geared up so that we can present it as part of a spending review next year.
Okay, Douglas Chapman.
Just one point. The Public Accounts Committee recommendations, number 3, the Department should demonstrate to the committee at the earliest opportunity that actual savings are being achieved. I don't expect a commitment on that right here and right now, but if we're looking at a report this time next year, what information can you provide that is going to give us that reassurance that some of the work you've said you're undertaking is actually going to be delivered?
So by the next time we come in front of you, there will be a much more mature assessment of efficiencies, and we'll be able to say much more about confidence levels.
Okay. Part of just one more question, if I may. Just part of the savings that I've noticed coming through are through the single source contract regulations, and I believe that again we have a line here. The department has pooled all the DE&S efficiency targets relating to the equipment plan, which presumably means that we can't look at individual savings that have been made. So how do we get to a point where we can track the savings on an individual basis, so we can actually see where the savings are being made, what's working, what's not as efficient as we thought it might be, so we can make a judgment on where the savings can actually be made in the future?
So we pooled them because there are a range of different legacy targets over many spending reviews, and we found that we were kind of looking and comparing and contrasting apples and pears. This year we've brought in an independent assessor to look at every single line, confidence levels, evidence behind delivery of savings, how confident we are that we can do more. So just because we're not disaggregating the single source savings doesn't mean that we can't track everything that we're committing to and banking on within our financial plan.
Would you look at possibly having that kind of discussion with NAO for next year's report as well, in terms of, we're trying to track the public pounds and how that's either been spent or saved, or where are the efficiencies that the government can make.
Entirely agree.
So it's a plea, I think, from the committee to say I think we need a bit more transparency around these issues, however difficult it may be.
Whole answer? Or?
Yeah, so I entirely agree with the NEA's recommendations, which are we need much more transparency and detail. The work's underway, and I would fully expect for us to be able to say more. And of course, some of that will depend on the timing of the spending review, but our intention is to have much more about confidence levels, more transparency and more detail in the report.
Transparency, will that include commentary? When we looked at the whole government accounts, we've said it's not just about the numbers matter, but actually for the average citizen and taxpayer, it's quite helpful to have a commentary. So you're planning to explain more as well. And particularly on the F-35, is anything there that we'll be able to report to Parliament on the F-35 programme as it unrolls, as we order them down, and the costs?
We had a pretty in-depth session, hopefully, on the F-35.
That's fine. We don't mind having the odd private session, but we are also keen, because we're the Public Accounts Committee, that we hear some of these things in public too, or see what's possible.
Okay, so I think that the timing of which we would be able to confidently make a judgment about the programme into the longer term is a little way off.
Right.
And
so
therefore,
give us an idea, when
well, let me put it this way. We're going to bring the initial operating capability for the Air Force as a land-based platform in this December. We then got a series of exercises where they will re-embark onto HMS Queen Elizabeth, and then she will conduct her first operational deployment in 2021. Now, until we've gone through that cycle, I suspect it will be very difficult to project accurately quite what that's going to look like. And I think by about that stage, we will probably be in a position where we would have a better understanding of the global support package in particular, and how multinational partners are actually feeding into that.
And conceivably, whether you reduce the number of B's for A's.
Well, I mean,
can I be clear, because you were pretty clear ruling that out earlier.
Right, I am absolutely clear that we have no plans, indeed no plans, and no one has submitted to me an alternative plan. So I'm interested to hear this media speculation. It won't be the first time we've had media speculation.
I think it wasn't.
About.
Yes, I mean we've had other, not just the media, but Deborah Hayes is on the button, I think.
Well, and I recognise it's a good sport to try and send a wedge between the services on this. What I would say is, arguably, I'm a soldier, you'll notice. We never do that. The reality of this is that I don't think this side of 2021 you're going to have data that would stand up to any scrutiny, in the first point. And secondly, on the variant type, it's not. I don't anticipate a decision on variant type this side of 2021 either, frankly, because you simply haven't got the experience to judge.
One of the other aspects of this, as we learned in our briefing, is that, of course, if anyone withdraws, it's not secret, but if anyone withdraws, any country withdraws from this, obviously the unit cost potentially goes up. So the US has said that it won't supply Turkey's share if Turkey takes on the S-400 surface-to-air missile. Presumably you're aware of that. Have you done any analysis what the impact would be on the UK's costs?
Well, at the moment, we are in negotiation with the Joint Project Office on the next series of buys, and inevitably that sort of factor is going to play into that negotiation. Until you really get a judgment on every other international partner's ambitions and whether there have been some modifications of those, no one will be in a position to make a judgment as to the UK share of that impact. And frankly, we haven't got to that stage in the negotiation.
So when you've nailed the price on the next tranche, can you keep to that price? Once
we have negotiated the price, that's a fixed price. And we are then locked into that and the off-take schedule.
Okay.
That's a fixed price, not fixed price moving forward.
It is indeed.
Yeah, so not going forward, but per aircraft, for
indeed.
That lot, yeah. Just going back to some of the points that Mr. Douglas Chapman was raising, but to you, Mr. Botham, this 2.2 million of savings you've banked. Have you got? So well, the 2.2 billion that's already calculated, already taken. So that you haven't hit the 4.2. They're not all certain. I'm talking about the ones that are banked as certain. How have you calculated that? Are you confident they'll be achieved?
So I'm just looking at just to make sure I zoom in on the right numbers for you. So I'm looking at figure 9 now, and the efficiencies confident in achieving column, that's 4.2 billion. Yeah. And then on top of that, I'm anticipating we'll be able to deliver somewhere in the order of another 2 after that.
Right, and
So,
how confident are you?
Well,
say,
we don't.
confident you can deliver?
So we have I think it's quite a rigorous system. And generally speaking, we don't log an efficiency until we've got a contract quality proposal. So that then allows you to be very clear about what the outturn
Can you give us
cost
some real examples of what type of efficiencies you're actually securing in that? Because obviously you've got to meet Ms Little's threshold now as well.
Well, yes, and she was very exacting
back,
in the evidence that I have to provide.
So can you share with us what sort of things you have to do
certainly
to satisfy Ms Little?
So I'll have to put together a business case submission that will demonstrate what the current cost, if it's a support arrangement. And a good example of that, probably one of the biggest efficiency programs, was the Titan program on Typhoon, where we took about 500 million out of that support program. So we have a very clear.
So what was the price, if you like, not the cost, the price of doing that for the Typhoon?
In terms
did
of
it de-scope or
no, not at all.
Maintenance?
No. So this was a joint challenge. It's a single source arrangement with BA Systems. We had an anticipated cost profile based on the contracts that we had in place. There are a number of contractors involved in it, and we underwent a 2-year. It took 2 years in the end, to go through the cost root and branch to look at how we could incentivise industry, and that's the key point. It's not a cost-cutting exercise. It is we look for a mutually agreeable solution that gives good business to industry and delivers capability to the general and delivers financial benefit to the MOD. So that was just over 2 billion, that contract in the end. And in terms of the question about how do we verify those costs, I've got an existing baseline and I've got a profile as part of the contract. It's not quite as simple as
so this was really looking at what productivity margins. Well, I mean.
Yeah, in this case,
I'm thinking maybe with any cheaper parts. I mean, how did you
So
go about
all of the above. So rationalising facilities, getting quicker turnaround times on spares, getting engineering capability at the front line to reduce the number of components that come off the aircraft. The mantra that every spare is a cost, not an opportunity. But critically, it is about having an incentivised deal with industry. So in this case, it will be a target cost incentive fee. So you've got a target cost, and if it goes above that target cost, they go into pain share. If it goes below that target cost, then you're in a gain share arrangement. These things take a long time, but that's probably one of the better examples I have.
Okay, and finally, Mr. Geoffrey.
Just before I ask my final question, a lot of this work with your suppliers is developmental, inevitably by its nature. How often with your suppliers do you negotiate intellectual property agreements?
Well, that's a fundamental issue that you've got to negotiate at the front end of any contract. So clearly, if it's a new platform, there'll be an intellectual property negotiation at the front end, and then pretty much when you get into the in-service phase, every contract break represents an opportunity to have discussions not only about intellectual property but the whole terms and conditions of any future commercial arrangement.
I answered the question though, did it? It told me what you were thinking about. It tells us what you're thinking about. How often do you actually do it, and how much money do you make out of intellectual property each year?
I couldn't put a number on.
Can you write to us about that?
Can I manage expectations? I don't think I could put a number in terms of intellectual
That tends to
property.
imply to me, Sir Simon, that you're not actually thinking about it in the way you should.
Okay.
We have done, I should point you to a previous report we've done on intellectual property where we touched on
I
it.
can assure you it's at the
Would you let
forefront.
this committee have a note on
With pleasure.
what you have done in terms of intellectual property?
With
Okay,
pleasure.
that's-
So
It's-
Captain
that's
Flanagan
what I
was going to add here.
Probably, I mean, the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory actually has the largest amount of IP activity on behalf of MAD, and we've recently worked across government as part of the balance sheet review with Treasury on looking at how we assess and monetise IP, so very happy to write to you on that. It's something we do every day.
Very much. So, Stephen, the FT had a report in September that you wanted to set up your cyber warfare unit, but you were wrangling over costs. Has that been resolved?
We have big ambitions for our offensive cyber capabilities. And part of the agreement at the budget was to make sure that some of the money that the Treasury allowed us to have extra would go against that particular line. We have a set of agreements in place with GCHQ which allow us to know how we would like to develop it in specific terms as to how we're going to spend the money and exactly what the money is. We're really waiting for the next budgetary round, which is effectively starting around now. So, yeah, in large part for the next year, yes, we are in reasonable shape. But again, it's one of those things that I think for the longer term will be quite a big part of the spending review discussion.
It seems to me that this is quite an urgent requirement.
It is.
And to be waiting on the next budgetary round seems to be a very unsatisfactory situation.
We have a lot of money which we spend every year through the National Offensive Cyber Programme, and I think that's 160. It was 160. It may be dropping slightly to 140, and we are going to top that up with some of the money that we got from the Treasury at budget time. I mean, if we were to snap our fingers and that money was to be not near 200 million, but it was to be $1 billion, we would not be able to spend that amount of money in the first year. So we have sufficient to get that kind of capability off the off the blocks and continue to develop it now. Certainly for the longer term, we will want to make sure that we have got enough money in the budget to be able to grow it, and it will grow quite a lot more, I hope, than what we have at the moment. Yes, but you should not worry about the fact that it is underfunded or unfunded. In fact, actually, for the next 2 years, we are putting significant resource in it, and we are very, very clear that it's an important part of our capability suite.
The FT indicated that you were looking at about 2,000 personnel. Is that the sort of thing we're talking about?
We are looking over a period of time to have a multiple of the number of people that we're doing it at the moment. There are limits to how much I can say in open forum about this, as you will understand, but it is certainly a very considerable increase.
And a huge issue for skills, which we won't.
And a huge issue for skills, because the kinds of skills in question here are very rare
and highly marketable.
Will
you be seeking permission to increase salaries for some of those senior people in this area?
The whole employment proposition will be an intensive area of discussion for the next 6 months. And it won't just be around pay, it will be about terms and conditions, to what extent these people are part of the military machine as opposed to... It's quite a profound set of discussions, actually.
Yeah, well, we touched on some of this actually when we were up in Rosyth, those of us who had that opportunity. Mr. Chapman.
I think this is the final question. The 14.8 billion that is expected to, in terms of your own figures that you've produced, in terms of potential overruns in budgets. Sorry?
The top end.
Top end, yeah. I'm trying to think of MOD contracts and various pieces of equipment that have actually been under budget over a long period of time. Maybe you know better. But the NOA also say that some of the analysis on your part remains optimistic, meaning forecast costs could be potentially higher. So at this stage, what is the worst case scenario? Would you anticipate 14.8 as being a reasonable figure to associate yourselves with, or could you see a scenario where it goes beyond the 14.8?
There's definitely a scenario where it could go beyond 14.8. Our job is to make sure that the scenarios are plausible and realistic, and that they're based on some sort of evidence. But I think it's fair to say that I've got more confidence in our short-term forecasting than our longer-term forecasting. So some of the less mature costs in the sort of 5 to 10 year period could be materially wrong. We do everything we can to make sure that they're not, but that's just the nature of forecasting. We've got a range of different maturity levels within the equipment programme, as we discussed earlier. But we tend to find that our historic analysis shows that actually we're far too optimistic about how much money we can spend, and quite often we can't actually get the contracts on order, or we can't get suppliers to deliver as quickly as we would like. So you tend to find that that's the problem we face, rather than over-optimism in cost.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time. The transcript will be up on the website in the next couple of days, uncorrected as ever. Our report won't be out till the new year, but we thank you very much for your time. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again all too soon. Thank you very much indeed.